Hello and welcome. We're just about to get started on our Creating Inclusive Spaces for Trans, Non-Binary, and Two-Spirit community members. We'll give folks another minute or two to hop on, and then we'll get started. Thanks for joining. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started on creating inclusive spaces for trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community members. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Sean Rager. I'm an employee here with the Montana Human Rights Network, and I have been doing work with the trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community for over a decade. So one of the big things that we want to start with is why a 101? Why a 201 and why not a 101? Well, many of you have seen me do a trans ally training before, or a trans 101. And the reality is I started doing that about 7 years ago. This is a picture from 7 years ago when I started doing that, when I looked about like a 12-year-old boy. Anyway, I just wanted you all to be able to move up your allyship to the next level and to start having broader conversations. One thing that I really did a lot during the Trans 101 was every training, I would start with a nerdy joke. And I would always say that the reason that I was starting with a nerdy joke wasn't because it had anything to do with being trans, but just simply because really the goal of the Trans 101 is to humanize the trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community. And really, during the time we were living in, and still today, it is incredibly important to humanize this community. One of the big things about it is that the trans community and our stories have been talked about for, a generation without us being able to control our own narrative and talk about who we are and where we come from and what our experiences actually are. So a lot of what we'll talk about today is how to empower the community to be able to share and control that narrative. But also we'll talk about things like how to step up your allyship and how to move it to the next level. So really what we're going to be talking about is building inclusive environments. There's some things that all inclusive environments have in common, and there's really going to be kind of 3 pillars that we'll talk about. Inclusive environments are places where intersectional experiences can be shared, where community members take the lead and allies follow, and where the environment is responsive and flexible in meeting the needs of the community. So let's start with intersectional experiences can be shared. We're going to do this a little different. We're going to break it down word by word. First and foremost, intersectional. Now, some of you may be familiar with the term intersectional, but at its basis, really what intersectionality means is that all of our experiences are made up and formed from a number of different things, from what our race is, from what our gender identity is, from our sexual orientation, from our physical ability, from our mental ability. And all of these combine in a very complex way to shape who we are, how the world sees us, and how we're able to move through the world. Now, it is impossible to have any sort of a truly inclusive space that is not intersectional. No queer or trans-friendly space is actually queer or trans-friendly unless it is an intersectional space. A space that is welcoming only to white experiences of transness is inherently a place where systems of white supremacy thrive and is not actually inclusive of anyone's gender identity. Now, from a personal note, it's worth saying that I was actively engaged in building spaces that were not anti-racist. And as a result, the entire community suffered, and especially BIPOC community members. When I say BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So let's talk about experiences. It's really important to know that there is no one narrative or experience of a trans, non-binary, or two-spirit individual. Society really has a history of TV talk showing the trans experience. You know, I can't tell you how many times I watched some sort of broadcast or show talking about trans folks where, you know, the narrative was, oh, well, I had to have this surgery to be who I was, or I was really just a man trapped in a woman's body. Well, the reality is that very few people actually feel that way, and everyone experiences gender in their own way. And it's really important to keep that in mind. It's also important to know that as a society, and even as a movement, we have not done a good job of lifting up and sharing the experiences of non-binary and two-spirit identities. This means that non-binary and two-spirit folks haven't had the ability to control their own narrative or even be seen or acknowledged for who they are. That's a real problem. Can. One thing that I want to talk about the word can is that it's really important that people have an option, but never an expectation or an obligation to share their experiences. This means when you're working with trans folks, non-binary folks, or two-spirit folks, it's always great to offer them an option to engage without the expectation that they actually have to be doing the work. It's really important for people to be able to engage in their own way in what feels meaningful for them. It also means that people are welcome to share as much or as little as they feel comfortable with, and in the ways that they feel comfortable sharing those things. Now let's talk about sharing itself. Coming out or sharing information can be incredibly vulnerable. It can be empowering and frustrating and terrifying or stifling. And sometimes it can be all of those things all at once. What's really important to keep in mind is that as an ally, this isn't about you. What information, how it's shared, or when it's shared isn't about you. And it's important to remember that if a community member shares something, for example, with one person, but not another person, it's not about you or your feelings, or if you're a good enough ally that that person shared. Really, it's about how the person wants to share that information. Sometimes it's just about opportunity. A community member should never feel obligated to listen to another person's understanding or feelings about their identity, experience, or own allyship. I think a lot of times when there's a concept that I'm trying to understand, especially in terms of being an ally, when I finally get it, I really want to share that. Or when I've had an opportunity to share something that I've learned from another person and apply that in terms of allyship, I really want to be able to share that. However, the reality is that oftentimes when we go back to those community members to say, hey, I finally understand this thing, or hey, this was something awesome that I did, oftentimes it becomes a burden, and community members feel like they need to acknowledge you for doing something that a lot of folks feel or hope will just be an ingrained thing and will be a natural thing and that will be a part of our society. So how do we do these things? How do we make it so intersectional experiences can be shared? Well, first and foremost, it's important to be actively anti-racist. Do your research, understand what it means, and show up. Let the community drive their own narratives, share in their own ways. Now, this means everything from art, storytelling, and messaging directly from the community. I think one thing that's really important to talk about, oftentimes when we talk about the community experiences that are shared, is that, there has been a surge of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit characters in the media and in Hollywood recently. However, what's really important is that those stories are being told and written from trans, non-binary, and two-spirit people. No trans, non-binary, two-spirit person wants to watch a show where their story or their experience is actually being told by someone who doesn't hold that experience or story. One thing that's really important is to make sure that the structure and culture is in place to be able to make sure that these things are working and moving. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And remember that this isn't about you. It's about the community being able to share who they are, being able to cultivate the world that they want to live in, and being able to do the work and manage the work and guide the work for themselves. So, structure and culture, you say? Kind of breaking this down, we're going to look at a number of different things. As we're going through this, really what we're going to be talking about is a number of different lenses. We're going to be talking about it on a workplace lens and different organizational lens. We're going to be talking about it on a political lens, and we're going to be talking about it on a personal and interpersonal lens. And a lot of these things can actually be applied to all of those different environments. So let's start with some of the structural stuff. Are there policies in place in your work environment or in your government affairs or all sorts of different things that make it so that trans, non-binary, and two-spirit people are heard, seen, and have equitable access? Have you done education and training? On a workplace environment, this may mean actually bringing in someone to do a Trans 101 or to talk about how to relate with your trans employees. On a personal standpoint, this could mean doing things like reading books from trans, non-binary, or two-spirit authors, or going and experiencing media that was created by those individuals. And then also on a structural point, this means practicing things like introducing yourself using singular pronouns, such as they and This means introducing yourself using your own preferred pronouns. So for example, hi, my name's Sean. My pronouns are he and him. Another way that you can do that, since we're using so much social media, is when you change your name on your Zoom account, you can put Sean and then in parentheses the pronouns that you use. Doing structural things like that can actually really help create an environment where trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks are able to share who they are. In addition, make sure that a lot of the things or all of the things that your organization or even you yourself are producing use singular they, them pronouns instead of he or she. Then let's move on to some of the cultural things that you can do. Always practice active listening. Now, this means keeping in mind, once again, that a person's identity is not about you. This also means instead of thinking about how you're going to respond to this person as they're talking, really try and understand what the person is trying to share with you. Be intentional about language. Now, some of this is a little bit on the structural part as well, and we talked about some language on the structural part, especially around pronouns. But this also means doing things like not saying, oh, I'm supposed to say this, or oh, I guess I'm supposed to do this. Because part of what that does is it sends the message that you're trying to do something because you're supposed to do it and not because it's the right thing to do, or you want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable. Part of culture is also showing supportive signs, inclusive materials, and showing up. Now, you can do this in a political aspect, you can do this in a personal aspect, and you can do this as an organization. And there's a lot of really great ways to do that. It means things like contacting trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks when something is happening to make sure that they know that they have support and people see them and care about them and are interested in helping them lead the work. It also means things like showing up and testifying at the legislature. It means things like contacting elected officials and other stuff like that. We'll get more to some of those logistics further down the line. Most importantly, don't wait to do the work until you know someone who's trans or non-binary, or you have a trans or non-binary employee or two-spirit employee. It's important to get started now so that you're in a place where you can already be doing the work and you don't have to be practicing when that person arrives. We're going to move on to the next pillar, and that is community members are empowered to take the lead and allies follow. Voices of community members are centered and not policed. This is a really important concept. You know, a number of years ago, when a lot of the anti-trans legislation started coming out, there was a lot of messaging and research that was done to understand how people should share their stories. And unfortunately, a lot of that messaging and research wasn't driven by trans, non-binary, or two-spirit individuals. And so this idea of the ice cream experience came along. Really, what a lot of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks were told was that it is really important to be able to connect to people. And to do that, it's important to show that we're no different than anyone else. So it's the idea that, oh, you like ice cream. Well, I'm a trans person also, and I also like ice cream. Well, something happens that's kind of unfortunate as a result of this. And that is basically, not everyone likes ice cream, and that's okay. But unfortunately, when we spend a lot of time saying our experiences are this way or that way, or each of us needs to fit into this very strict and rigid gender binary, it eliminates the voices of people and experiences that are different. And it makes people feel like they can't claim their own identity because it doesn't match up entirely with the narrative that they've been hearing for so long. Community members are allowed to do the work themselves and given the resources to support it. It's really important that folks are able to determine for them what is the work, what is meaningful, and how to share. Allies work to tear down boundaries that prevent the work of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community members from being seen. This is really important. This means doing things like paying attention to your social media and looking for the articles that were written by trans, non-binary, or two-spirit folks, or including an article that was shared by a trans, non-binary, or two-spirit individual. It also means doing things like sharing your platform to be able to lift up the voices of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks. Okay, this is a two-part one. First and foremost, credit and payment is given to community members for the work that they do. Now, the reasoning behind that is that it is an incredible burden to do the work and have a diverse identity. It's really important that community members are able to drive and do the work. However, it's also incredibly important to realize how much of a burden that is on the community. And it's our job as allies to make sure that whatever burden that is, we're not adding to it, and we're making sure that people are being compensated for the work that they do. Allies do their own personal work and do not put a burden on community members to explain or validate their own experiences. Now, oftentimes this means taking to the Google machine and doing some research, finding good books that are written by trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks, or finding a training that's already available to be able to utilize. Every community member decides what work is meaningful to them. For a lot of people, sometimes just being themselves is an act of resistance, is an act of saying, you know, the far right and conservatives may say that I cannot be who I am, but I am going to be who I am. And for a number of folks, that act of resistance is what they're able to do. And it's great that they're able to do that. For other people, they decide that they want to engage in a deeper way, and that's really great too. But it's important to allow for trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community members to decide what level they want to engage in. Every community member has the power to share or not share their own story in any way that is meaningful to them. This goes back a little bit to the ice cream story that we were talking about. I'm sorry, I see that there is lost audio. Can people still hear me? Is that the case for everyone? Okay, well, we'll keep moving along. It looks like there are a number of folks who do have audio. Okay, so every community member has the power to share or not share their own story in any way that is meaningful to them. Sometimes this means doing it in art. Sometimes this means going on Facebook and posting a long rant. It's really important that folks are able to share those ways, share their experiences in ways that are meaningful to them. And it goes back to the ice cream example. So let's break this out a little bit into work for the community and work for allies. Work for the community. It is important for the community, trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks, to be able to determine how, when, where, and what stories to share, and what experiences to share. This kind of goes back a little bit to the idea of not outing anyone without their permission. It's also important to note that there's a number of folks who share very personal parts of their stories, and it's important that they're able to determine how that information is shared, and it's not further shared without their consent. It is also critical for the community to be able to determine how, when, where, and what policies to pursue. This means that even if there is a great policy that we think will help the community members have to be able to take the lead on that policy and decide for themselves if it's something that will actually positively affect their lives, and if the amount of work to make it happen will actually be a benefit to themselves. Community members must be able to decide how, when, where, and what it means to live authentically. This is really important because it is all about living your authentic life. And when we talk about policing trans bodies and all of the messages of the narrative of people not being able to share their own experiences and their own stories, a big part of that is people being able to is people being told how they can express themselves and what and how they're doing it. Some work for allies. Oh, excuse me, there's one more. Work for community. What roles allies will play in the work. I know that sometimes when I'm working on a presentation or a training with someone, my availability is dependent, or there are different things that are happening in my life that may make it more or less difficult, and I may need more or less help. So sometimes when I'm working on just being able to deliver a training for someone, it can be really helpful to have someone do the advertising or to be able to reach out and make sure that all of the tech is working, that sort of thing. However, I've also been in other experiences at a different time where I really wanted to be in control of the advertising or make sure for myself that the tech worked. So I think that it's really important to be able to talk to your community members when you're working on stuff with them and make sure that you're listening to what they need from you. So going back to this idea of work for allies, it's important as an ally to share with credit and permission the stories and work of community members. We've talked about this a little bit before, but this kind of sums it up. To increase your own personal understanding of what it means to be trans, non-binary, and two-spirit, and to help others increase their understanding by calling cis people and allies in. I use the term cis, and what that is short for is cisgender, which means someone who identifies with the gender assigned to them at birth. And it's really important to offer support and platforms to the community. One thing that can be really helpful when we're doing some work on social media is to have an organization come forward and say, hey, I want to partner with you and I want to offer you a social media takeover where everything that's posted on my social media for the day is about trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks. That can be a really powerful tool. So we're going to move on to this last pillar, and that is the environment is inclusive and flexible, so to meet the needs of community members. What is the environment? Well, basically, the environment is you. It is politics. It is your workplace. It is other workplaces. It is businesses. It is where you live. It is where you social media. And it is where others social media. So we're going to focus on a couple of these. We're going to start with you, politics, workplace, and then we're going to end on businesses. It starts with you. I've said this many times throughout the presentation, but it's incredibly important to continue to do the research. What does that mean? Well, it means when you hear things like, there's going to be a bill that attacks the rights of trans youth to be able to participate in sports. It means actively seeking out information about why it's important for trans youth to be able to participate in sports and understanding why this is one particular area that people are going after. It's important to learn how to apologize. Whether you're trans, non-binary, or two-spirit, or an ally, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to say or do something, use the wrong pronouns, get in the way, put your foot in your mouth at some point or another. And it's really important to learn how to apologize for that, to take credit for the impact of what you did, and to be able to move on from it. And with that apology, make sure that you're not making it about you. It is also really important to learn how to be receptive to feedback. Oftentimes we do something that we think is really great or has a really good intention behind it, but because we're not a community member or don't hold that experience ourselves, it makes it really difficult to actually understand the impact of some of the things that we say. I will note that I will not spend time giving feedback to someone that I don't think is worth it. So, for example, If there is someone from the Family Foundation or another organization that I know does not support my right to exist and will probably never support my right to exist, I'm not going to stop them in the hall and say, oh, by the way, when you use the wrong pronouns for me, it actually was hurtful. Or I won't stop and say, oh, hey, I don't think that you realized that you said this, but actually you did. And here are some of the repercussions of saying this particular thing. So it's important to know that that feedback is actually a gift. It's an opportunity to grow. And it's not to say that your intentions were bad, or that what you said was intentionally hurtful, or that you're a bad person. It just very simply means that you said something that was potentially harmful. And I care about you enough and believe in you enough to know that you don't want to continue that behavior and that you want to know for the future. Learn how and where to share feelings. This kind of ties into a little bit of what I was just talking about. Oftentimes, being an ally or being a community member can be incredibly exhausting. There is a lot of stuff going on in the world right now that makes it really hard. And we know that our trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community members are continually under attack from the media, from movies, from political agendas, from the far right. And it's incredibly important to be able to have and experience your feelings, but it's also really important to know how and where to share those feelings. I know one thing that sometimes happens to me is when there is a negative bill happening, or the administration has done something harmful to the community, a lot of people often contact me who are not community members to tell me how upset they are. And oftentimes that puts a big burden on me because we're all upset and we're all impacted. But I carry a special type of impact to me. And so it's important when you're sharing those feelings to have someone that you can share those feelings with. Or if you've made a mistake or used the wrong name or pronoun for someone and you have a lot of feelings about that, it's important to know who to share that with. I had someone once at a seminar recommend having an accountability buddy. That means someone that they can reach out to and say, hey, I said or did this thing and I'm having a lot of feelings about it. Can you talk me through it? And that person is able to listen to them, to know and hold them accountable for what they did, but also to be able to acknowledge and help them work through their feelings. Another thing that I have heard about when, where, and how to share feelings involves dumping out. Some of you may have heard about this. And kind of the idea is that the people that are most impacted are in the center, are really feeling the weight of everything that's happening. And then the further removed people are from that center, you have community members, you have friends and family, you have allies, et cetera, et cetera. And the further you are removed from that center, the more feelings you may have, but it's important to make sure that you're not sharing your feelings on people who are more directly impacted and carry more of the burden. It's important to make yourself available so that those folks can share their feelings with you, but don't necessarily have to share the weight of your burden and your feelings. Learn how to recognize and interrupt transphobia, misogyny, and racism. Now, a lot of us have sat at the Thanksgiving dinner table with our families and have heard them say or do problematic things. And oftentimes, a lot of us experience survival mode. Is this something that's worth engaging? How do I talk about it? Do I want to say anything at all? I will say one thing that I really hope of my allies is that they will go outside of their comfort zone and push through that discomfort to say, hey, that comment that you made wasn't actually funny. The thing that you just said was problematic. I actually don't think that you really understand the people that are being affected by this. And it's uncomfortable for us. But the reality is that oftentimes when people share a transphobic, misogynistic, or racist comment, or even something that is borderline on that, or we're not sure, but may be problematic, if they're not confronted with it and they're not told they shouldn't be saying it, they will think that it is okay and they will continue to say those things. Now, it may not happen overnight that all of a sudden you make one comment and your problematic uncle all of a sudden stops saying a lot of transphobic things or just understands. But eventually over time, when people are continually called out and continually told what they said was not okay, then oftentimes over time, they will change that behavior. And it's that long game that's important. And finally, don't just learn how to do this, practice all of it, because the reality is that all of these things are things that take practice, first of all, to learn and also to excel at. So let's talk about politics. We have to talk about politics when we talk about trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals, because our lives are so deeply impacted by what's happening in the political environment. So the first and most important thing that you can do is to vote and support candidates that are supportive of LGBTQ folks, and specifically trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals. It is critical. Our lives depend on it. And don't just vote, but vote down the ballot. This means going through the races and doing some research on individuals that you may not have heard of to make sure that you're actually supporting folks who are supportive of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals. And even small races that we think won't have an impact can actually make a really, really big difference in how the community is able to move through the world. This includes everything from the school board to judges to the city commission to the state legislature and the governor and all the way up to the federal level. The thing that's really important about voting all the way down the ballot is the further down the ballot you go, as in the smaller the race, the more of an impact your vote will have. Don't be afraid to contact your elected officials. Oftentimes when we have some sort of negative legislation that is coming up, one big thing that will happen is we will send out information across social media and contact people via phone banks to contact their elected officials. It's really important that even supportive elected officials are able to hear from their constituents to be able to stand up and have the coverage that they need. Participate in phone banks. So some of you may or may not be aware of what a phone bank is. I really enjoy the phone banks that we have with Montana Human Rights Network and Equality Montana. Oftentimes we do them the most in the middle of a legislative session or when we're working to try and get a supported elected official. Now, what a phone bank is just coming in or even working in your own space and clicking on a link that will take you, and it will give you phone numbers so that you're able to contact individuals in different regions. And oftentimes it's asking them to vote for an individual, to care about a particular issue, or to contact their elected officials and tell them to support or stand against a particular issue. If you're ever interested in phone banks, you can contact anyone at the network and we can get you plugged in and more engaged in that. It is a really great way to make a big impact. And I personally think that it's a lot of fun. Volunteer to elect queer-friendly and trans and non-binary and two-spirit friendly candidates. This means doing things like knocking on doors, turning out to events, and supporting those candidates financially. And finally, turnout in support. There's a lot of different ways to engage, from everything from sharing posts on social media, to writing letters to the editor, to actually showing up to support folks during a hearing when there's testimony being heard. Turn out, don't be afraid. It's a little bit of an uncomfortable experience if you haven't done that before, but part of being an ally means pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone to support others. And of course, don't be afraid to post on social media. Now, I've said it before during this presentation, but it's really important when we're posting on social media to make sure that we're lifting up the voices of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals and supportive organizations. Let's talk about the workplace. The best way to be supportive in the workplace of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks is to hire those individuals. And to make sure that when you hire those folks, there are clear supportive policies around when someone changes their names, around pronouns, around uniforms, that sort of thing, to make sure that they are coming into a welcoming environment. Not only is it important to hire trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals, but it's also really important to invest in them and their long-term success. This means things like appointing them to boards or making sure that they have all the support and resources that they need. It also means promoting and hiring them through a process of leadership development or development through the organization. Do not tolerate inappropriate language or remarks, especially ones that are targeted at trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals. It's really important. This will have a big impact on your workplace, and even small comments or individuals who intentionally misname or misgender someone can have a profound effect on the health and well-being of your trans, non-binary, and two-spirit employees. It's really important to stand up against this language and not allow it. Invest in the community and show up in person, in letters, and on social media. We talked about that a little bit in terms of politics, but the same lessons also apply to the workplace. You know, it's really important to be able to utilize your resources as an organization to be able to lift up the experiences of trans, non-binary, or two-spirit individuals. And if you see something happening, like there is comments being made about people being able to access the proper bathrooms or different things like that, take it as an opportunity to stand up and say, hey, we see you and we support you. Another example of a way to respond that has been in the news lately is there are a number of organizations who have actually stood up and said, hey, we're Harry Potter fans too, but we actually really think that it's important that trans women are seen as women and trans men are seen as men. That sort of thing can be really important. And if you're not sure how to engage on that level, a really great way to do it is to simply share information that other folks have already created. Not only does it lift up the voices of the trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals that are affected, but it also ensures that the language that you're using is appropriate and effective. Business. Let's talk briefly about rainbow capitalism. Some of you may be familiar with this word. For others, it may be something new. But basically, rainbow capitalism is the idea that businesses have taken the rainbow or queer signs and used it as a way to create investment and to create wealth for themselves without actually investing in the communities that are affected or without investing for liberation or change. It's really important to know that there's a difference between an organization that sells a lot of LGBTQ stuff and a business that is actually supportive. A business that is actually supportive will use the funds that are generated and turn them back into the community. It will use their platform as an organization to lift up the voices of affected folks. It will have training that is inclusive. It will have bathrooms that are accessible, and it will be doing the work. It won't just be benefiting monetarily from slapping a rainbow on something. Support LGBTQ-friendly local businesses. There are a number of businesses across the state that have actively signed on to letters that have been heard in the state legislature, to an Open for All business campaign, and invested in community resources and organizations. Support those businesses. It's really important that they know that you're there. And it's really important that they get the benefits from being able to support individuals in a way that isn't just about rainbow capitalism. Encourage businesses to have gender-neutral bathrooms. This is something that's really important to make sure that the space is accessible to everyone. And not just gender-neutral bathrooms, but also handicap-accessible bathrooms is really important, and making sure that this space itself is accessible. Support LGBTQ artists and performers. This is especially difficult and especially important in the times that we're facing now with coronavirus. And finally, ask for more. If you have a queer-friendly bookstore, don't be afraid to go in and say, hey, I'm looking for this title, or I'm looking for more information about this topic. Or if you have a business that is selling t-shirts, go in and ask them to support designs that are made and benefit local trans, non-binary, and two-spirit artists. So don't stop here. This has been one part of a broader conversation, but it is only one small part of that conversation. And there's a lot of other resources and training available. It's really important to utilize that as part of being an ally. If you haven't seen the Trans 101, we do that presentation regularly, and I'm happy to share information about how you can host your own Trans 101 or get plugged into a pre-existing one. We also host workplace equality summits and specific training for businesses and organizations that want to be more inclusive and accepting of LGBTQ and specifically trans, non-binary, and two-spirit individuals. Our friends at Transvisible Montana have a fantastic presentation called Navigating Allyship Through the Genderverse. Look them up and don't be afraid to utilize that as a resource. And of course, don't forget anti-racist training. It is a crucial part of being LGBTQ friendly, of being friendly to trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks, and of being an ally as a whole. And finally, don't forget to follow Equality Montana on social media. Summing it all up, intersectional experiences can be shared. Community members take the lead and allies follow, and the environment is responsive and flexible in meeting the needs of the community. When we do all of these things, that is how we build a truly inclusive environment and a truly inclusive space for trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks. We have just a little bit of time for questions. If you have any questions that you would like to share, go ahead and submit those now. We'll get to as many of them as possible. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for your questions, I would just like to thank you all for joining us today. As many of you know, this was one part of a series of trainings. We are going to be also hosting a training at 3 p.m. that goes from 3 to 4. And the link that you used to join today will also be the link to join that training. And then of course, tonight we have our big celebration and we're really excited to see you all there. It doesn't look like anyone submitted questions. If you do have a question, you can submit it in the chat, or you can reach me afterwards and I will answer that question privately. My email is shawn@mhrn.org. That's SHAWN@mhrn.org. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.